So I am Evi-Karita Riikonen from ERIC. ERICs is one of the environmental RIs, stands for Integrated Carbon Observation System. We have a head office in Helsinki, Finland, and I have been in ERICs since 2015. I joined at the end of the preparatory phase, and I've been involved in many things during these years. And as Irena mentioned, I have been involved in matters related to socioeconomic impact and its assessment. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about things that would be useful to consider before assessing socioeconomic impact. I will start with some basic definitions. This might be quite obvious to many of you and quite self-explanatory, but I think it's good to sometimes go back to the very basics and think again about what it actually means to assess socioeconomic impact and what actually is meant when we talk about socioeconomic impact. Then I will share with you some findings from a survey that was conducted within the ERIC Forum implementation project about the current status of ERIC's socioeconomic assessment. We were asking if they had already assessed their impacts and what kind of challenges they faced and what they found useful or less useful. So some key findings from that survey. And then reflecting on those results, I will discuss a little bit about things that came up in the survey and things that would be good to consider. And then towards the end, I will talk a bit more about building up an impact landscape, by which I mean the need to showcase impacts along the way of the RI's life cycle. So some kind of food for thought for that kind of narrative to be built. And also you might see quite a few times the acronym SEI in the slides. So that stands for socioeconomic impact. So if we start from the very basics, what actually is socioeconomic impact? It is obviously a very complex concept, especially in the context of RIs, because there are so varied impacts within them. That it is such a heterogeneous landscape of RIs that we can't really say that there's only one type of impact that should be assessed or could be assessed. But in broad terms, it means the direct or indirect effects to either to the economy of a community or an area, or the social or cultural practices in that community or area, or effects to the livelihoods, but not limited to those. The effects are the results of intentional actions of an organization or infrastructure. I've highlighted here the words community, area, and actions because I find it quite useful to go back to these words and think that, okay, this is who is impacted and where the impact happens, and also what is done to generate impact. So it's kind of useful framework to keep in mind, even though it is, of course, obvious, but it's useful nevertheless. And what does it then mean to assess the socioeconomic impact? Again, it varies between the RIs, but in broad terms, it is about identifying the pros and cons of these actions for, again, the specific community or area, or for specific processes. It's about evaluating the costs of actions against the benefits for the community or, again, the area or processes. And it's, again, about evaluating the resulting consequences. So it's also a useful framework to think when planning an impact assessment. And after these definitions, I will now go to the survey and present you some key findings from the survey. So the ERIC Forum implementation project carried out a survey about the current status of the socioeconomic impact assessment among ERICs and those in preparatory phase. The survey covered only RIs that formed around the ERIC principle, but I think these results resonate with other types of RIs as well. We sent out 32 invitations. We got 26 replies, so the response rate was quite nice. Within the survey, we had 23 distributed infrastructures and 3 that were single-sided, so the majority were distributed. We had 5 scientific domains covered. So we had environmental ERICs, some from the health and food sector. Then we had some from the physical sciences and engineering, energy, social and cultural innovation, and then one that was operating in the combined fields of health and food and social and cultural innovation. Then we asked them to identify or define who their stakeholders were. And we got quite a varied response. Some said that their stakeholders were the funding bodies or the policymakers. Some said they were the universities, member countries, or national ministries. Others mentioned researchers or the fellow ERICs and RIs, national research councils and facilities, data management professionals, and also the general public. So we had quite a varied response and from different sections of society, for example, if you like. 16 out of the 26 had not yet assessed their socioeconomic impact. And those that had assessed, out of them, 4 had done it more than once. So they had conducted this assessment in different stages of their RI's life cycle. 4 of them had done it after the first 5-year period, so in the early operational phase or after the very first operational years, and 2 had assessed it later on, so after 2 or more 5-year periods. 27% of those that had assessed, of everybody, so all of the respondents, 27% had not defined the socioeconomic impact for their RI anywhere just yet. And those that had a working definition for it had defined it in different places. Some had included in the strategy documentation. Some had used a specific pathway or impact area where they had described the aimed for impacts. Some had linked it to the evaluation process, either to the scientific evaluation that they were required to conduct every 5 years or so, or to the wider evaluations such as express evaluation. Some had developed specific success stories that they used to communicate their impact. And they also mentioned documents like work plans, statutes, vision and mission statement, 5-year plans, or other type of policy documents. So again, the definitions were included in different places and kind of different areas of the RI's management or managerial structure. And then we asked the ERICs that if they could describe the process that they have in place for carrying out the assessment. And again, we got quite a varied response. Some said that they had done it or are planning to do it in connection to their management plan, or they generally just do it through KPIs. Some had been using the currently available tools that were developed, for example, in the Accelerate and RI Path projects, and had done it internally. Some had also used a mix of internal and external resources. So they had used some readily available materials or guidelines internally, but had also sought expertise elsewhere to support it. Some ERICs indicated that they did indeed have internal resources, like specific resources that were dedicated to this assessment. This was often linked to annual reports where KPIs were reported. And some also said that they carried out their assessment in connection to a EU-funded project. And those that had not yet assessed their impact mentioned that the assessment actually requires quite dedicated resources, but they had not simply had time to allocate those yet, or had not been able to allocate them just yet. Some said that they were planning to carry out the assessment while they were developing their indicators, or while they were developing their management or sustainability plans. Some were planning to use an external service, but some were planning to use a process that would be defined internally. And again, they said that they would probably link it to the scientific evaluation process. And some said that they would only carry out the assessment in a later phase of the RI's life cycle. And the indicators that they had used could be grouped into 11 areas. They were obviously very varied. There were quite a lot of them. We had asked them to identify maybe 10 to 20 main indicators, and some said, of course, that they had much more than those. But broadly, the areas under which indicators have been developed were related to data visibility, engaging decision makers, publications and other contributions to science, education, training, some scientific and policy related activities, services, quality of the network or amount of the personnel, their users, to the funding and cost benefit ratio, or synergies with other RI's bodies and industry. So the themes were very varied again. And also, as we can see later on, some of these indicators were more related to the RI's performance, and some were related to longer term impacts. But 92% of all of the respondents were of the opinion that defining socioeconomic impact of the RI and also assessing it is very or somewhat challenging. So the majority thought that it is actually an area that is very difficult to comprehend fully. Some of the most challenging aspects that they brought up, this is like a combined analysis from those that had assessed and those that had not yet assessed, but those that had not done it yet were also foreseeing similar kind of challenges that were or had happened to those that had already engaged in the assessment. So one of them was the geographical dimension, especially in the case of distributed RIs, because of course, subsequently you get impacts on many scales. So you have the local level, you have the regional level, you have the pan-European level. So how do you go about it? Then they mentioned quite a few times, they mentioned traceability or trackability. So how is it possible to link the data that the RI generates to the later use, especially when there is a longer time frame between the data generation and then its use by somebody else. They also said that defining what societal and economic impacts actually mean in the specific context of the RI was problematic. And subsequently, the indicators became quite difficult to define because some impacts are intangible, such as community building. So criteria becomes quite difficult to determine. And they also mentioned that there's a lack of a unified methodology or a framework, and also lack of dedicated funding. These were the main challenges. These were obviously not the only ones, but the ones that were mentioned most frequently. Then we also asked them what they would like their stakeholders and policymakers to know about the actual assessment process of the socioeconomic impact. Not so much about what the impact itself would be, but what goes on behind the scenes, so to say, when you need to assess and the whole process of assessing. They said that the actual process of assessing the impact is important, and it is fundamental. This importance is acknowledged by stakeholders, so those that expect the RI to demonstrate its impact. So they also need to know how important it is to dedicate time and effort to generate a process where assessing the impact becomes meaningful. They said that it would be helpful to have relevant distribution of funding inside the RI so that they could cooperate multinationally. So not just assessing the impact nationally, but to keep in mind that because, for example, especially when the RI is distributed, it doesn't really help if you just assess something nationally. You somehow need to get the bigger picture through multinational cooperation. But also the RI itself needs to keep communicating and explaining its impact to stakeholders and policymakers so that it's able to highlight the RI's importance to society in all the phases during the RI's life cycle. Because this narrative is something that they felt was important. It's not just that now we started and here's after 20 years, here's the impact, but the dialogue needs to be there the whole time. And they also said that the usage of data and the services and the data policies should be defined clearly so that it's easier to enable trackability of the RI generated data. Finally, the respondents then provided some suggestions for the Commission and for the stakeholders in general in what they could do in supporting the ERICs in carrying out the impact assessments. They said that it would be helpful to have some examples of how they could improve the impact and especially how this impact is linked to funding. They also would like to have more guidance in relation to assessing the impact, defining indicators and methodology, and they would welcome some case studies that would guide them on the way. They also highlighted the fact that because the ERIC community and the RI landscape in EU in general is very diverse, it is important to recognize the individual purpose of each RI, because comparing them to each other is not seen beneficial. Some, for example, mentioned that kind of forcing the same way of assessing impact or the same kind of indicators is not working for everybody. And also some RIs will produce more tangible impacts or more direct impacts than others. So they also said that it would be important to have the freedom to develop RI-specific most suitable indicators and impact pathways. Also, what was mentioned was the need to recognize the value of qualitative indicators alongside quantitative ones. So not just measure things with numbers, but also add a narrative element to be able to really tell the story about impact to support the quantitative measurements. And also they would welcome some support from the Commission and stakeholders to develop the ways to ensure that the RIs are properly credited for the data they generate. So they should be like a cooperation about this as well. So these were the key findings from the survey. And I wanted to reflect a little bit on those results in the next section of my talk to kind of think of some things or kind of some starting points for some of the challenges that they had identified to see if that would help to break down the whole process into a bit smaller areas and maybe make it a little bit more easier to start the whole process or start planning the whole process. So before trying to assess socio-economic impact, it's useful to really reflect on what is it exactly that is being assessed. So defining impact in the context of a specific RI. It should be linked to statutes and strategic goals. So what is it exactly that our RI is doing in very simple terms? What is the overall aim for impact, and is that definition clear? Does it actually exist? What is it that should be the very overall outcome of the actions that the RI performs? And then the expectations. I think this is quite a fundamental part of the planning. What is expected from the RI, and who is expecting it? Because different groups have different expectations. We saw earlier in the survey results that RIs had identified quite different stakeholder groups. So of course, all of those groups would have their own expectations. So what is considered when we assess impact? Do we consider all of them, all of their expectations, or just some? And if you only consider some, we should somehow make it transparent that we are assessing this to be able to show this. And in this assessment, for example, we are not focusing on some other aspects. And then the scope. I talk about locating the impact. So, like I said in the very beginning, I had highlighted the words community and area and actions. So what is the organizational or geographical area that is being assessed? Is it the whole RI, or is it, for example, only some central facilities or only some national nodes? Are there some geographical differences, for example, or are they all included in the assessment, or should they be assessed somehow separately? Would it be easier to have several smaller assessments so that one would be able to get a bigger picture? For example, in the case of distributed infrastructures, how can we synchronize the impact assessments in a way that would cover the area that we really want to be included in the assessment? And then to think about the timing of the assessment. We saw in the survey results that ERICs had assessed the impact in different phases of their life cycle. Some had already done some preparatory assessments in the preparatory phase. Some had done it more than once, for example. So it's useful to think about what the purpose of the assessment is. Are we actually attempting to measure some actual impacts? Is that even possible? Is that feasible in the life cycle, in the current life cycle? Or are we exploring, for example, potential paths towards impact that will materialize later? And most importantly, what is it that we want to know? So this goes back to really thinking about this in the same way as we would when defining a research problem. What is it that we want to know? Why do we want to know it? And how can we get the answer? And then about indicators. Now, this is where it becomes quite problematic, of course. We saw that people had, or the RIs had different themes under which they had very different indicators. If you think about the RI and its activities, that is the input that the RI produces. And when it performs its activities, the output is measurable performance. It does what it's meant to do. So it produces performance. And this performance is usually measured by key performance indicators. But then what happens after? Because what is the end result of that performance? So we could think that there are two types of end results, so to say. There's outcome, so the direct effect of the RI's performance, something that's quite easy to pinpoint maybe in a quite short time frame. And then we have actual impacts, which are longer term effects of the RI's performance. And these could be measured by impact indicators. So we have two different types of indicators to measure slightly different things. So the survey revealed that some of the indicators that were in use were more related to the operational performance and some to longer term impact. So for example, when we produce publications, that could be seen as performance. And then when the results in those publications are used by policymakers, and eventually this results in change in climate policies, then that could be seen as societal impact. So that's why it's useful to sometimes differentiate between key performance indicators and key impact indicators. And also, when thinking about key impact indicators, some would measure direct effects and some longer-term effects. So here's one example from ERICs about the difference between KPIs and key IIs, so key performance indicators and key impact indicators. We have a KPI that is called the usage of ERICs data in publications. And what we measure inside that KPI are the number of publications per year and the cumulative number of citations. And then we want to see if those publications have impact, then the direct impact is measured by analyzing the use of articles that are actually used outside the scientific domain. And then when we think about a longer term impact, we would develop a narrative to see how our science supported improved targeting of climate mitigation efforts. So we would see if there was a reduction of damage by extreme weather events through more effective climate mitigation policy, for example. And both of these types of indicators would actually lead to the strategic objective. In our case, is climate action support. So our objective is to communicate science-based knowledge towards society and to contribute information that is relevant to greenhouse gases, to policy and decision making. But if you look at the KPI column, we have a KPI that is the same, that usage of ERICs data and publications, but then we have a strategic objective that is much more abstract, saying the communicating science-based knowledge. But how are these two linked? So that's why we need to have different types of indicators that we can build up a story towards fulfilling this objective. And now if we think a little bit about how we could build up an impact landscape. So how could we think about showcasing impacts along today? This is very much now food for thought. I have simplified this idea quite a lot, and I am by no means saying that these would be the right or wrong examples, but they are something that could be somehow developed in the context of specific RIs. So as I've mentioned earlier, demonstrating impact is a very long process, because typically the impacts of an RI will be measurable or visible after a longer time period. That's why it's useful to build up an impact landscape through a narrative that describes how the RI's current or future performance in all areas of the RI is producing the direct and longer term effects. If you think about what I mean by impact landscape, it would be something that consists of relevant impact pathways. So the RI Paths project has defined, I think, 13 different impact pathways, and they have defined the pathway as a simplified causal chain of events as productive interactions that connect to activities carried out on a research infrastructure to identifiable effects on the economy and wider society. So it's a chain of events. It's also been called value chain sometimes. One of the impact pathways that they had defined is, for example, this publication, citation, recognition. So this pathway follows the idea of a knowledge push, where the RIs generate these publications either themselves or via their users. And in turn, these publications are cited, and then they become part of new body of knowledge. And this body of knowledge later finds recognition within a broader research community and society. Well, problem is that it can be conscious or unconscious. So again, we are thinking about the traceability of data, for example. But final recipients of the knowledge generated by the RI then may further translate it into economic benefits or apply it to societal problem-solving efforts. So these are the kind of narratives in a form of defining a pathway that would create an impact landscape and then could be narrated to also to the RI itself, but to the stakeholders and policymakers. And here's now a very simple or simplified, well, I know the slide is not very simple perhaps, but the idea behind it is quite simplified. So if you try and see what would it mean to narrate an impact landscape? I have added here 4 of these circles that each include a phase in the RI's life cycle. So we have the preparatory phase, early operational or implementation phase, fully operational phase, which means after at least 1 5-year period, and a mature operational phase that would be at least 2 5-year periods. These are not any official definitions of what each phase means, because they might differ between the RIs, but you get the idea behind it. So in the preparatory phase, the RI is probably aware that there's a strategic goal saying that we should communicate science-based knowledge towards society. And some stakeholders might say that, okay, so how are you doing this? And can we see some evidence? And of course, in the preparatory phase, when RIs are usually defining the processes and activities towards the operability and towards the direct and longer term effects, it's not so straightforward to see how this impact would be actually happening. And so what should we tell our stakeholders or somebody else, the general public, about how are we producing this impact that is not visible yet? So the narrative could be something like that now we are currently constructing our infrastructure to be able to facilitate data production for scientists to use. So in the next phase, this data will be used in scientific publications. And then when the RI moves to implementation phase or early operational phase, it is now starting to measure performance, perhaps. It might have started already earlier, but now it obviously has been performing its activities for some time, so it's possible to measure. There's some evidence of direct effects as well. So the narrative could be something like, now our performance enables the generation of data that has started to appear in publications. And now when we move forward in the next phase, these publications will be used by policymakers. And then again, the operationality of the RI continues. They are again measuring performance. More direct effects are produced, and there's evidence of longer-term effects. And now it becomes easier to even start assessing some direct impact. So the narrative could say something like, now our performance enables the data through these publications to be used by policymakers outside the scientific community. And again, in the next phase, it will be used to implement mitigation methods to tackle climate change. And then when they move towards mature phase, performance is of course still measured. Direct and longer term effects are produced, and it's also possible to assess longer term impact. So the narrative could be something like, now our data has been used by policymakers to implement methods for climate change mitigation, and as the result, we can see now that the extreme weather events in this area are less frequent than 10 years ago, for example. So all of these phases in the life cycle have elements of producing impact, but it's of course on different level depending on the capacity of the RI. But this way, it's possible to somehow narrate a story towards this longer term impact and towards fulfilling the strategic goal. So it might not be so kind of invisible in a way. But while it's important to have a dialogue with stakeholders about the socioeconomic impacts, as we saw from the survey results where ERICs had recommended that the RI would have an ongoing dialogue with stakeholders. It is equally important to engage the whole RI community so that it would be possible to demonstrate how their combined effort produces impact, because this is quite important for community engagement. And also it's good to show, for example, funders that each part of the RI is equally important in producing the hoped for impact or fulfilling the expectations. This is again a very full picture, but I've used an example from ICOS. So for example, if we were to explain how the combined effort from our activities produce certain type of impact, I have chosen one of our strategic areas, which is the scientific excellence. We have defined some core activities in each of these strategic focus areas. And we have also defined the main processes and tasks of each of our components related to each of these activities. So for example, our national networks generate data and process it. Then our central facilities do the data quality control and quality assurance. And they are supported by the head office, who disseminates the developments and facilitates community engagement. And our data portal, together with the central facilities, take care of training and user support, for example. And again, similar kind of tasks have been defined in other core activities. And then governance and management, for example, comes into it as well. It's important to show also the place of advisory bodies and General Assembly in producing impact. Because, for example, our General Assembly needs to approve of data policy, approve of label stations, and the advisory bodies need to guide on scientific and ethical methods. And now, from these combined activities, we have defined KPIs. For example, that ICOS data is used in publications or is cited. So this is the combined effort from different parts of the RI. This is the output of our RI that has effects on science. And these effects we will then be able to measure with impact indicators. So direct effects that our publications are used outside the scientific domain, and then longer term impacts that hopefully there will be reduction of damage by extreme weather events through more effective climate mitigation policy, because our data has enabled these policy makers to, for example, make more sustainable decisions. So just a few things to summarize what I've just been talking about. It's important to define the impact in the context of specific RI. What are the expected impacts? Who expects them? And where are they defined? For example, in the statutes, business or sustainability plan and strategy, and also that the definition is understandable. And then it's important to think about the nature of the defined impact. Is it actually related to performance? Is it outcome, so direct effect, or longer term impact? So it's important to differentiate between performance and impact, because sometimes, of course, it's feasible to measure performance, and then sometimes it's more feasible to measure impact, and sometimes maybe both. And then it's useful to think about the time span within which the performance and impact are considered, because they can vary tremendously between different types of RIs. It's useful to think if it would be useful to have separate sets of indicators for different phases of the RI, for example. And finally, it's important to remember that it's equally important to communicate the impact to the stakeholders and also to the whole of the RI community. Thank you. This was all of my presentation so far. So I would now welcome some questions or discussion that you might want to have.